Hello everyone, thanks for joining me for another Tips Tuesday video. Today we're going to be talking about kind of the basics of shutter speeds and camera settings based on the wildlife you're going to be photographing. Last week we talked about doing some planning, doing some research ahead of time before you go out into the field to improve your chances of finding wildlife when you're out in the field. And today we're going to be talking about just the basics of understanding what kind of camera settings you should have based on what you're expected to find when you're out there. So there's a lot of different settings you can adjust for your camera. Namely, we're going to be talking about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, to start, I shoot in manual mode, so I adjust my aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all manually. And the first thing I do is set my aperture. So that's the easiest thing to set. For me, I usually shoot wide open, which for me would be 2.8 on a 400mm lens. If you're shooting a 500mm or a 600mm or anything else, it's going to be an f4 or maybe a 5.6. Whatever it is, I usually set it to the widest setting. It lets the most light in, and it's really just kind of a good spot to start. You can adjust that later if the situation calls for it. And then I go shutter speed. So shutter speed, there's a lot of variables in it, and it really depends on the subjects you're going to be photographing, right? Now there's kind of a general rule of thumb of you should have your shutter speed of pretty much 1 over your focal length. So for me, I use a 400mm. So pretty much the idea is the minimum shutter speed you should have to to remove the motion blur in your lens would be 1 over 400 for the shutter speed. Now, it's kind of an outdated rule because the stabilization in your lenses and the cameras these days allow you to have much slower shutter speeds than that, even just handheld. But it's kind of a good rule to think of. It's just kind of a guidelines to think of I'm going to start that would be the lowest I would want to possibly go without using some extra support or really being cognizant of steadying your camera. But then it's going to be kind of dependent on what you're going to be photographing. So if you're going to be looking for large mammals, like for instance here, it would be kind of like white-tailed deer or black bears, I'm going to be able to use a slower shutter speed because larger animals, even if they might actually move pretty fast, because they're so large, their perceived motion is actually a little bit less. It looks like they're moving slower, even if they might be moving pretty fast, if that makes sense. It's a little confusing. But once you get into talking about birds, it makes a little bit more sense. So if I'm photographing a mammal, a deer or so, I might have it at 1/400th of a second, 1/500th, 600th, anything around there, because I can use that slower shutter speed, and that's going to allow me to have my ISO nice and low. If I'm going to be photographing, say, birds of prey, I'm out in the grasslands here, I might be photographing northern harriers, I'm probably going to want to have a faster shutter speed because even though it's still a big bird, they move pretty quick. And if I want to freeze the motion of their wings, I'm going to want to have a shutter speed somewhere around the 1 over 2500, 1600th of a second, something around there, to be able to freeze the motion and make sure it's a nice sharp image with the bird moving pretty quick when it's soaring over the grasslands. Now, when you get into even smaller birds, say you're photographing warblers or small songbirds, because they're so much smaller of a bird, their wing motions are so much quicker than a larger bird needs to be. If you've ever watched kind of like a goose taking off, right? It's a big bird. They have a lot of weight to lift off the ground, and their wing beats are pretty slow relative to their size of body. Now, when you look at, say, a chickadee taking off, you can barely see their wings when they're flapping to take off. So you can kind of get this idea that, okay, smaller birds, I'm going to need a faster shutter speed because I'm going to need to be able to freeze that motion because their wings are moving a lot faster to lift off that little body compared to a goose taking off. So for a small songbird, I'm probably going to be having something up in at least the 1/1600th of a second, if not higher, probably like the 1/2000th of a second, something along there, to be able to really freeze that motion and make sure I get a sharp image of that bird when it's moving. Now, this is all relative, right? Because you can only have a shutter speed that high if you're willing to also increase your ISO, because chances are you're not going to have perfect lighting. You're going to have probably low lighting, especially in the forest. So you're not going to be able to have your shutter speed as high as you want, because otherwise you're going to end up having to bring your ISO really high. Now, the cameras these days are really good at having high ISOs, but still you want to keep your ISO relatively low so you don't introduce that noise to the image. So what you can do is you can still keep that lower, slower shutter speed of maybe 1/1000th of a second or 1/1200th of a second, something along those lines for the small songbirds. But you just have to pick your times when you're actually going to take a picture of that bird when it's still perched and you'll still be able to get a nice, clean, sharp image because the bird is actually then still at that time. It's really when you're doing birds in flight, that sort of thing, you're going to need to crank up your shutter speed pretty high to be able to freeze that motion nicely. Now, it's all relative, right? Because it all depends on what you're going to be photographing. And this is why doing that preparation ahead of time, realizing what species you're going to actually encounter when you're out in the field, really helps you have a framework of understanding of, okay, I kind of already know in my head what I'm going to have my shutter speed set to, because this is what I'm expecting to find out there. If I find mammals, I'm going to be able to have a slower shutter speed and still get nice sharp images because they're not going to be moving as fast. But then if I find a small songbird, a small sparrow or something on a tree or on the grass, I'm going to want to crank up my shutter speed pretty high so I'll be able to freeze that motion, freeze that bird, and get a nice sharp image of that bird then, okay? So that's just a really basic, rudimentary understanding of kind of how to set up your camera and the thinking and the thought process you can have when you're setting up your camera so you're prepared when you encounter the wildlife out in the field. Okay, so that's going to be it for this Tips Tuesday. Like I said, just a really quick rundown of different settings. I'm going to include some further reading, further kind of explanation of this in the description down below, some sources that I use that would be really helpful for you. That way I don't need to go in full detail here. But that's going to be it for this Tips Tuesday. Next week, we're going to be talking about kind of when you get to the field, when you get out of the car or you show up on site, what you should do so that you're prepared for the first encounter of wildlife that you find. Okay, so that'll be next week. That's going to be it for me today, and I will see you again in the next video.